Yeah, well, the globalisation issue is an interesting one because Melbourne had been very heavily into what would now be called corporate international style architecture. Curtain wall buildings, line and plain, high modern movement as embodied in the 1940s and the 1950s. And this project was very much a proposition that went against that. And it may have ultimately told against the project in the sense that it was never ultimately built. If this project had the idea of addressing two things, it certainly did these two aspects which Rem Koolhaas has raised in relation to the Venice Biennale. He has raised the question of modernism as a 100-year phenomenon, not as a 1920s to 1950s or 1960s phenomenon, which is what a lot of the calls for a functionalist state library in Melbourne were really looking at. And he's addressed the question of national identity, or at least of cultural specificity, or of cultural resistance to an international continuum. Now, this project, as envisaged by Edmond and Corrigan, with McConnell, Smith and Johnson, and with the Astorian architect Clive Lucas, certainly tackled both of those aspects. The modernism that's involved in the project is modernism of the last 100 years. In other words, it's modernism pre-1920 as well as post-1920. So it's modernism of Sullivan, or it's modernism of John Monash and the articulation of a 1900s modernism. And it's also a modernism of cultural specificity. It was one which sought from the outset of this competition to address what it was like to be a great public building in Melbourne, Australia, and to be a great monument of secular liberalism and of library, research, public life, museum. A reaction towards incorporating a much broader sense of context, so that it was Melbourne of the early 20th century, it was Melbourne of the 19th century as well. There was an accord between Melbourne as a great Victorian city, as a great mid-19th century high Victorian city, and there was an accord with Melbourne as a fascinating early 20th century city as well, as a city which still in 1914 was probably the 20th or the 21st largest city in the world in terms of official population levels, and it was a city which was embracing modernity and modernism through reinforced concrete, through electricity, through public transportation, through a suburban culture which was rapidly unfolding and which was still in some way answerable to concepts of great city buildings and of great city buildings that could embrace that. And it had two of them on the site already. It had the library building from 1854 into the 1920s, and it had the Melbourne Hospital of 1904 to 1916 on the site as well. Which I think because it argued more than anything for the greatness of that public benefit idea of healing, of being able to walk in off the street and just access a literary culture, a written culture, and a realm of ideas. And it was not only the world realm of ideas that was embodied in that building, it was Melbourne and it was Australia as well. And it was to become a monument for Australian written culture and for Australian ideas that would rival in majesty the lawmakers building at the other end of the city, the Parliament building, and it would rival in immensity and in urban force the sporting shrine which was to Melbourne's immediate east. That is the Melbourne Cricket Ground, home of the 1956 Olympics, home of course of, in many senses, of Australian football and of gladiatorial cricketing contests over well over 100 years. Now, the idea that a library might actually take its place alongside the sporting, the legislative and the war monuments as something with a particular iconic or representative force was something that was quite novel. And I think this design captured it more than anything at this particular time. Now, the other aspect of experience was, how do you experience Melbourne as a city? You don't experience it as a plaza city. Melbourne was in the process of building a large civic plaza because every city in the world was getting a plaza at that time. But Melbourne you experience both from the main north-south streets and the east-west streets, but you also experience it as a kind of tartan grid with its little streets, which are the next scale down, and then with a series, a sprawling and casual series of alleyways that thread up, particularly north-south, through the central business district. And it's these alleyways which converged and which were threaded through and re-established and reasserted in this design.